But of course, you have corporations behaving badly, you have them skirting the law, you have them underpaying their workers, you have them bribing government to be able to get large subsidies, you have them doing all these things. And we shouldn't be surprised. We shouldn't be surprised that corporations commit capitalist acts. That's what they do. In fact, if a CEO weren't in the business of being able to squeeze that extra $1 or $1 million out of Congress, if a certain firm weren't in the business of trying to undermine the Environmental Protection Agency, that CEO would be out on their ear for failing to generate the kind of shareholder value that he is legally, or she occasionally is legally required to do. So the interesting question is not why do corporations behave badly. That's we kind of set it. We set the rules of the game up that way. The interesting question is why do we have global markets in food at all? That's the interesting question. And global markets in food are fairly new. The first real sort of global market in food was only completed at the end of the 19th century, and it was really engineered by the British. Now the British went to, the British were interested in having cheap food to feed the workers in Manchester and Liverpool, workers in the workshop of the world. And what they wanted was access to cheap wheat. And it just so happens that India, and particularly the grain basket of the Punjab, was a great place for growing wheat. Now, Punjab, until the British came along, was largely a sort of feudal setup. And what that meant was that you had land that was sort of taken over by landlords. You have landlords and you have peasants working on the land. And it's a lousy setup, right? Because the peasants sort of toil away and then they give their surplus to the, to the landlord. And then the landlord gives it back just enough for the peasants to survive. It's pretty crappy. The only bright side in feudalism is this, that in a bad year, it is the landlord's responsibility to feed the peasant. It's called a moral economy, that there is, between lord and serf, this idea that if things go wrong, the lord has some responsibility towards peasants. So when there is a bad year, the landlord will make food available, will open up the granaries. Now, the British came along and they saw this, and they thought, well, look, landlords, we the British have an idea for you. If you forget this idea of giving away free food to peasants, you don't need to do that. We have a much better idea, and it's called markets. And you will find out, stay with us here, what you need to do is introduce these markets. And so what you do is pay peasants for their labor, and you use as much labor as you need. And then you'll be able to produce much more of your crop. And then it gets better, because then we'll buy it from you, and we'll ship it back to Britain, because we have people who'd like it there, and you'll become rich, and it'll be fantastic. Win, win, win. And the landlord said, no thanks. And the British said, no, we have guns. And so it was that, I mean, it was a little bit more complicated than that, but basically the idea was that actually through violence, but through also a certain sort of degree of good intent. So the British genuinely thought that they were bringing progress by bringing the cutting edge in economic theory of markets and international trade to the Indians. And to some extent, of course, the British didn't lie. By bringing these international markets in food, they found India produced more grain than it ever had in its history. Millions of tons of grain were being exported from India every year at the end of the 19th century. But when you introduce markets in food, you introduce two very simple rules. The first rule is that if you have money, you get to eat. Even if you're halfway around the world, if you're connected by the market to a food supply, your dollars or pounds in this case will be able to shift food from the grain basket of India all the way to Manchester. But if you don't have money, and this is the second rule, if you don't have money, then you starve. And that's what Indians who had been turned into a rural labor force found. That even at the height of India's grain production, millions of people were starving. The historian Mike Davis has done some incredible work on this, and I recommend his book, Late Victorian Holocausts, to you all. It's not a very cheery title, but it's a brilliant book. And what he found was that there was a moment, for example, where the British were surprised. They'd come to India with these great visions of social change and progress, and they were slightly appalled to find that since they arrived, in the 120 years of British rule, there had been 31 serious famines since they arrived. And that contrasted with 17 famines in the previous 2 millennia. So break it down for you. I mean, under sort of this feudal system, appalling feudal system, there was a famine once every century, more than once. I mean, it was less than once a century. But when the British arrived, there was a famine with the regularity of an election cycle, once every 4 years. So this is the kind of progress. This is the kind of the vision that stitched together various parts of the world, and this is really the basis of the modern international trade system. And India is sort of ground zero for this yet again. India is a country where, I mean, when you hear of India in the newspapers these days, India is the place where, you know, everyone is, you know, when you phone the gas company, someone in India will answer. You know, everyone in India has PhDs in computer science, and you have people on the sidewalk sort of mending computers with chisels. But of course, India is an incredibly poor country. You know, I mean, when I was growing up, people said, you know, eat your greens, there are children, well, my parents said, eat your greens, there are children starving in Africa. What do you think parents in Africa say? Parents in Africa say, eat your greens, there are children starving in India. And they are right. There are more children starving in just 5 Indian states than there are in the entirety of sub-Saharan Africa. And that's not a story you hear. A story you don't hear is that 1 in 6 of the world's farmers is Indian. And the stories that matter to them are about agriculture, about hunger, about the schemes that have been variously tried on them to be able to improve their output. And we can and we probably should talk about the Green Revolution in questions. But I guess what I want to observe is that there have been a sort of package of measures that have been dumped on Indian farmers, particularly since the early 1990s. And this is a package of measures that basically sort of, they are neoliberal, which is to say that they are about shrinking the state and bringing the free market in.